People talk a lot about legacy, and sometimes it's very self-focused. My grandmother's got this generosity of spirit, my mother's got this generosity of spirit, and that's carrying forwards. The legacy of having your identity reflected in the stories and the literature, and knowing that you are enough and that you matter and that you're beautiful, like that is legacy.
Welcome everybody to the next episode of the Impact Policy Podcast. My name's Sam Johnson. I'm the Managing Director here at Impact Policy, and I'm proud to be joined today with Kate Weber. Today we're going to go on a bit of a deep dive, both personally and professionally, into her journey and how she's got here today. And I'm sure it's going to be a valuable episode for people in the sector to take away a lot of stuff to consider, to think about, to reflect upon as well. Before I go any further, I want to take a moment to acknowledge country. We're here at Impact Policy HQ. We're on Gadigal country, and want to pay our deepest respects to our elders here, both past and present. Want to recognise that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land, that it was never ceded by treaty. And if you are a first-time listener, long-time listener, please take a moment to follow the work that we do, share it with your networks. If you feel like you get some sort of value out of the content that we create, please share it far and wide. It helps us to continue do what we do, and your support means the world. Before we go any further, I might hand it across to my friend Kate, and I might let her introduce herself properly. Tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're from, what you do, and all that sort of thing as well. So thank you, Kate.
Thanks. Yama everyone, I'm Kate Weber. I'm a Gamilaroi Ngarrabul Dunghutti woman. I also just want to acknowledge country as well. I'm here on Gadigal lands, and I did spend a lot of time here growing up as a kid, so I do feel a deep connection here as well. So it's really beautiful to be here, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, I thought maybe a nice way for us to sort of start is to just hear a little bit about your sort of journey personally. I know you do a lot of stuff. You're quite active in terms of Aboriginal affairs at the moment, professionally, in terms of what you're doing. But we generally like to hear a little bit about people's stories and a little bit about people's journeys in terms of how they got to where they are today. Know that you're also a woman of many talents. I think anyone that's maybe connected with you on LinkedIn or any other platforms would know that you've got a range of various endeavours that you're conquering, academically, creatively, professionally, and everything in between. But where would we start? How do you want to sort of give us a bit of a sort of journey piece around Kate Weber?
I think a lot of it starts when you're a kid, right? So I think about like sort of what led me to being so passionate about working, to improve outcomes for mob. Growing up as an Aboriginal kid, saw my family face a lot of discrimination and challenges, and face them myself as well. Although each generation, I've seen that improve, which is what we want. But still, worth noting that. And it was nothing that, growing up that way until I started school. I loved being Aboriginal, and I've always loved being Aboriginal. But when you start to get when you start to face racism, which I did when I started at school, you start to realise. Not realise, but you start to have a bit of a conflict in your identity, right? And so I've gone through periods as well where I've carried a lot of shame, like a lot of mob have, and it's so conflicting because you're like, I love my Aboriginal culture, I'm so proud of it, but at the same time when I talk about it, people can really degrade it or be quite negative, and Definitely. So carrying that forward. I guess I come from a family that also a lot of service. So my dad was in the Navy, really wanted to just serve people. My uncles were in the Navy. My grandparents, they worked at churches, donating their time. They had a boys' home. They were really just always trying to help people within the means that they could. And my grandmother, she's passed away now. She's a beautiful Aboriginal woman. She often the people that have the least give the most, and she's just always welcoming everybody into her home and being like, here, nah, Bob, have this, and just one of the most beautiful, generous spirits that just cared so much about people. And so I guess when I think about what leads me to wanting to improve outcomes for mob, it's been so I'm like carrying forward the work that they've, you know, paved the way to be continued. And it's sort of, I kind of don't even look at it as if it's just me. Like it's sort of like that I'm continuing that generosity and that giving as well. Yeah, absolutely.
So you touched on a few things there around what it was like growing up as a young person, navigating identity and belonging, and all those interconnections as well with family. And I guess how that links back to what you're doing today and that sort of stuff as well. Did that sort of stuff shift as you got older, or is that something that still you wrestle with today? Like what did it look like I imagine you took us back to little like
little Kate.
6-year-old you know, Kate Webber, you know, like what did that look like as you sort of moved through those different sort of stages?
Yeah, so primary school was probably the hardest, and these days I've sort of gravitated towards having a real interest in psychology and mental health, and so come to understand that at that age you're very influential, and it's really critical in your formation of identity and confidence and things like that. And it's often when we first start to notice differences as well. So like we'll notice people's skin color's different, or people are practicing different culture, using different words, those kinds of things. Whereas in that sort of preschool daycare, kids aren't really noticing that. And so that's a big thing, and it's too many. I mean, no mob should have to go through it, but when you start primary school, particularly like when I was in primary school, they're not teaching Aboriginal history, they're teaching colonisation. First project I ever had was Captain Cook. Like it was like do a big poster board of Captain Cook, and it's like, where's my history? Where's my family history?
Yeah, definitely.
And so that formation of identity, I've kind of lost what you asked me. That's probably going to happen a couple of times.
Nah, look, not at all. I think we're talking about like that identity journey, right? Like, and where you went to in terms of like, little Kate Webber, in terms of where she went to from there. And I guess you talked about a bit of the intersection there with psychology and mental health and well-being. I know we're both big fans of Dr. Tracy Westerman. I'm sure we'll have a yarn about some of her work as well. I know that's impacted you a lot, but I think we were going down that sort of road a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. And for anyone not aware, I do have a bit of a spicy brain, so it might happen a couple of times, so apologise. I guess I've gone through periods in my life. It was more so in primary school when I first started, because mum raised us to be proud Aboriginal kids. I was doing like Koori dance, growing up with my cousins, just, in the sprinklers barefoot. That wasn't, I didn't know any different, and it was just so beautiful. And then, it started in school and kids started making fun of me. They'd be like, oh, you look different. Like what are you? And I'd be like, I'm Aboriginal. And they're like, oh, what percentage are you? And you're like, what? It's not a percentage thing, and that starts to impact you. So I think there was a big chunk in my schooling when particularly in periods where I wasn't going to schools, because I did change schools a couple of times, where I wasn't going where there was any people identifying. There could have been mob, but they weren't identifying. I kind of just didn't talk about it anymore. Like I just kept it inside, and it was sort of, that creates this real divide, right? Like you're this, you're living it and breathing it, and you're so proud of it at home, but then you feel like as a safety and security thing, you just can't talk about it.
Totally.
And so, and I guess over the years, I just started to care less. Like and I think like the more I've spent time with mob over the years, and the more I've just lent into it. And I think that's a testament to my mum and my family as well, keeping us as connected as possible no matter where we were. I think that just gives you so much strength and confidence.
Absolutely.
And you just start to go like, no, like, if I'm making you feel uncomfortable because I'm Aboriginal, then that's your problem. That's not mine.
Definitely. Yeah, I think a lot of the stuff you say sort of resonated a lot there, particularly around identity and belonging. And I think for me, it even took me back to being a kid and knowing that my dad was Aboriginal, but identity wasn't a massive thing in our household. And then because I was so fair, and I was in a community where there wasn't a lot of mob, I was, almost told that like I didn't belong in community. And then it wasn't until we'd finally moved back into our community, and I'm so young, I was in primary school still, and I went and a lot of mob at my school, at primary school in Glebe, and was at the Kui Club photo, and there was like so much fair skinned mob there in the photo, and it was like, I remember I was like year 5, so like 10, 11 years old, and it was like, I was like, oh, these mob look like me, like it was this thing in my head, like I'd grown up so disconnected, my father didn't grow up with a strong connection to his identity, and so for me it was like something that I was almost told like it's not, that's not really yours to belong to or to connect with. And so I was so lucky to be able to grow up in a community and a school that recognised that just because of how you look doesn't define your identity and your culture and sense of belonging. But if I'd stayed in that other community where there wasn't a lot of mob, where pride around Aboriginality wasn't at the forefront, it probably would have been something that I hid and didn't talk about, and wasn't proud about sharing with my other broader networks too. So yeah, that really resonated heaps.
My you just made me remember something, and it's a saying that I've heard a lot of mobs say, so I'm not, it's not yours to take, Grandma, but she used to say to me, she's like, cup of tea's still a cup of tea, doesn't matter if you put milk in it.
Yeah.
And so she was one of many children, and she was the last one, and so by the time they got to her, she always used to joke that they ran out of the colour, because like by the time they got to her, she's a little bit fairer than a lot of her other siblings.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I think that can be a big thing for mob, because we don't all look the same, and we didn't even before colonisation. So it's a hard thing for kids to navigate, and just really resonate with that, and that power in being around other mob that you can connect with, and how that got you through that is so important.
Definitely. I think, for me, like, being able to grow up in a community with my people helped me actually understand why that my own family, my own father's expression and challenges with his identity, once I started to understand our history, it made me actually even more proud, because it was a cultural expression of how he was navigating, surviving the impacts of colonisation and what that had meant for his family. And that was his lived experience, and so I wouldn't have had that understanding that was the lived reality of what our communities and families had been through. When we think about forced child removal, we think about the impact of the state and how that plays out in our communities and how they exist and survive and all that sort of stuff as well. We're digressing on. This is not my podcast either, so.
It is.
But we are connecting and sharing around some of those common threads. I wanted to sort of lean into. So we're sort of, we're probably in our high school sort of time now, and different stuff like that with your sort of journey. You're super passionate about mental health and well-being. And you've started a bit of a journey academically in that sort of space. Where has the inspiration come from with that? And is that connected to, like many of us, who go on those sorts of journeys and people in those spaces, I'm sure, like, is that connected to lived experience? Is that connected to stuff around your experience as a young person? Yeah, can you talk to us about some of that, if you feel comfortable to or safe to explore that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's probably two directions I'll take that in. The first, I'll do my Aboriginal side second. So the first side is like mental health has been had such a significant impact to my family. Like I've seen, so my grandfather on my non-Indigenous side, he was a Vietnam veteran. PTSD, real struggles when he got home, and being rejected, coming home. and irrespective of, views on war and whatnot, he was in the service, and this man was, trying to help in a way that at the time, we as a country were focused on. So if I then look at my, Aboriginal side, just everyone in my family always saying sorry, always like, I'm sorry, I'm taking up space, I'm sorry for this, I'm sorry for that. And it's like just sorry for just generally existing. It just breaks your heart.
Absolutely.
And it's so normal for us that we don't even notice. And watching in particular, my grandmother, she really struggled with self-esteem, depression all the time, and she was just such a beautiful, warm, generous person that had such a debilitating self-esteem that you kind of looked at her and went, why? Like, you're so beautiful and amazing, and you just give so much and care. And so I come to find out, as kids, Mum tried to protect us from some information. Come to find out that, my grandmother ended up having to go on medication for her depression. It resulted in relationship issues and addiction to that medication, which really severely impacted her life. Fortunately, the relationship repaired and she got through that addiction, but that was a really big thing for their family. And then my mum, again, always saying sorry. Whenever anything went wrong, she's like, oh, that's my fault. And you're like, but it's not, Mum.
Totally.
And I still do it to her today. I still growl her for things. I'm like, nah, Mum. Stop saying sorry.
Totally.
And so I think when you grow up with that, you see it in your family and you start to wonder why. But then as you grow up yourself, then you start to notice that you're picking up some of those phrases and some of those ways of thinking. And then I guess if I look at, we're looking at childhood, so you start primary school, suffer, racism, bullying. And I got bullied for two ethnicities of mine. So, I would openly identify about being Chinese as well as Aboriginal, because Mum's Aboriginal and Chinese, and got it for both. Like it was any array of awful things that people would say. And so then as you move into high school, that bullying really impacted me and had really awful self-esteem. And it's probably only since my mid to late 20s that I've really worked on that and made that a lot better. And I would say it's still got a long way to go. So, actually went through some real troubled times, and I'll just give a bit of a trigger here for anyone listening, and I won't go into too much detail.
Yeah, of course.
But, when you've got that low self-esteem, you set the bar really low for yourself, but also when you grow up with so much suffering around you, it also can bring a compassionate thread as well, where you start to look at behaviours. It's not the individual, it's just their behaviour, and you think you can fix everyone too. And that set me up for not a good recipe in what I was looking for in a partner, and left me vulnerable. And so towards I think I was 16 when I met my partner at the time. Puppy love, you think it's all amazing. I even got engaged. I was just like, nobody knows anything, I'm in love. Ended up moving in with him, and it got really nasty really quickly. I had, so I mentioned we moved around a bit. Dad was in the Navy. So at the time when I met this fellow, we were living in WA, and then Dad posted back to Canberra. And I was like, no, I'm going to keep that relationship going. So I saved up, moved back to be with him, and then I was isolated. I got no family over there, got hardly any money. He was spending all the money, and then before I knew it, started to get really difficult and abusive. So that impacted me as well.
How old were you here?
So the relationship started about 16. The unsavouriness, I would say, would be around 17, 18. Really awful time. And then as a result of that, just mental health just plummeted. You feel really hopeless, and that isolation doesn't help as well. I was very fortunate that I had a close girlfriend that did live over there, because that's where I did high school. And, I just stayed at hers for a while when it got really bad that I decided I had to change it and just leave. I left all my stuff. Like I was just like, I just got to get out of there.
Absolutely.
But then ever since then, so for like over a decade, having to repair the damage that did. So I was already kind of set up mental health wise for, accepting less and being used to people, talking in a really negative, hurtful way, and then it kind of leads to that. So went on a journey of trying to heal and get better, and it's been a hard process, but I'm at this point now where I'm a mum, and I can name things and better understand like what's going on from a psychological standpoint to be able to navigate it, and feel a bit more empowered with strategies. And I just want to give that back to mob, and see the importance. So with my family, with me, I see it with my friends.
Totally.
Yeah, I just want to give back. It's so important.
You said something at the start of that yarn about going on a journey, and I wrote here what helped, because you sort of talked about being in a pretty rough place for a period of time. I think you said to about your mid-20s, something like that, and then you navigated through that sort of phase. But what really helped, and if you were speaking to that 17-year-old Kate right now, and there might be someone listening who's going through that, or their sister's going through that, or something like that, like what did help for you, and what would you tell that young person if you had that opportunity to sit with her?
So I'll start with what helped. What did help was being connected with people, and I did go through a period where I really shut down and kind of I was isolated to an extent. I was spending, when I wasn't working, I was spending every waking moment sort of just with him. But then, slowly but surely, and I think it's in some instances, it actually, I guess I got lucky in a sense that when I started a new job to try to get a bit more money, I developed some friendships, and because I was with them all day working with them, that really helped me. So I'd say connection was such a massive one, and it was not an intentional thing that I had, but I think that's something that made such a big difference. And as I started to see that and how people were treating me and caring for me, I was like, maybe that's not okay. Like maybe that
deserves something a bit better here.
Yeah, exactly. And you start to believe in yourself, and people might say little things that they just think nothing of. They're like, "Oh, you look nice today," or like, "That's a really smart thing you just said," and you're like, "Oh, really?" Like,
absolutely.
So it just, but some people I know are in situations where they can't seek that out. So I'd say also, if anybody sees anyone who seems like they're struggling and really sort of internalizing and withholding from people, sometimes just gently, incrementally, like, "Oh, hey, how you going today?" And then slowly build that up, because forcing it and kind of, "Oh, like, let me help you," it won't work. But that incremental, it gives them autonomy as well, because it's that real lack of control that you have when you're in those really awful situations.
I think that's great advice as well, particularly for friends, family members, colleagues that might pick up that there might be, someone might be having a bit of a tough time, or there might be, relationship or situation where things maybe aren't great. And I think what you said, it's about that gentle connection and building of connection and relationship with people that you feel like might be in those sorts of spaces, as opposed to trying to get someone to just tell them everything that's happening, or feeling like you need to try and fix everything for them, or immediately expect that someone's going to feel safe enough to be able to share what is even happening, with them as well. I think that's really valuable for people listening that maybe are indirectly, seeing this in their friends or family or things like that.
I think there's a real misconception that I've seen, at least, also around, people can think that you went into it knowing that it was going to be bad, and not, sort of, I had a therapist in my early days that talked to me about frog in hot water. The water's cold at the start and it slowly gets hot and the frog doesn't notice. Totally. That kind of thing.
I think the frog in hot water is a great analogy. I think about it all the time. And so you talk about connection. Connection was a big thing for you coming out of sort of that period. Was there anything else that you would sort of reflect on or share with anyone that you think is really could be really helpful?
Starting to get a bit more control back helped me as well, and the control wasn't necessarily full financial freedom or anything like that, but it was being able to go like, no, I'm going to go, I've got these new friends, I'm going to go and have a night, and you know that would result in arguments and things like that, but those friendships, and outside of that relationship, it actually improved the mental health holistically anyway, which is why I'm sort of using it as an example, because aside from that connection with the friendships, it's actually also this is, you know, I'm going to do something for me, like this is something that I enjoy, and it's a bit of control and autonomy in your life, and just that starting small and seeing that, and then as your confidence starts to build, you start to do more things. It has this carry on impact into everything, and then it kind of carries on to like, I'm going to actually invest in my health and well-being, because unfortunately, as a result with the mental health and how bad that situation was, I had eating disorders as well, so I was really withholding everything. It was almost like a self-punishment type thing. And you know, I noticed as I started to feel better in myself because of those connections, you know, then I started to go like and eat more, and then I felt even better still, and then, you know, exercise again, and you start doing the things that you used to do, but that you kind of gave up on. And I think that's, you know, that happens so much with depression. You just give up on everything, like that hopelessness.
Definitely.
Yeah. Definitely.
And I think that's really powerful for people to hear and think about for themselves. And I think much of that power comes in the reality. It's easier said than done for some people to be able to say like, oh, well, you know, I don't have a job, so how do I have that opportunity, or different things like that. But I think coming back to that real critical principle around connection, because we know that such a big part of that control in relationships that are toxic is about isolation. So if you can crawl back some type of connection to family, to community, or socially, however that may look for you, if you're listening, you know, that's a really, really powerful protective factor for yourself on that journey ahead. I think that's really, really, you know, thank you for feeling safe enough to be able to share that part of yourself. I know that there'll be someone listening to this that will take something from that, and I think that's really important. You also said that there was 2 threads around that sort of journey in terms of psychology and mental health and well-being. So you started with talking about your non-Aboriginal side of your family, the impact of coming back from the Vietnam War, the threads of that intergenerationally. You've talked about your own personal experiences in terms of relationships. Is there another side or another thread that sort of inspires the motivation for thinking about that sort of path that you're looking at?
Yeah, there's probably a couple. So, and I mean, it's all, it's impacts to mental health. Really, ultimately, it's just seeing so much suffering around me and knowing the disempowerment and the empowerment of the brain. And, particularly when we look at the lens of racism and racial trauma, and this is why, I have so much respect for Dr. Tracy Westerman and, what she is focused on through her Gila Institute. That racism piece, she talks about it's inescapable, and she's arguing that it should be considered its own form of PTSD, racial trauma.
Yeah, that's right.
And so when I see that, because it's inescapable and because it's attached, to your identity, that's such a real struggle for people. And there's so much, treatment. And this is also something that I saw in my family and goes to that second thread around, it's always at the treatment phase, and it's always, here, have these pills, take more medication, or just toughen up. And that's just not how it works at all. And nothing good ever comes from a position of shaming someone or being in a position of shame. And I think a lot of, the experience I saw in my family and some of my earlier experiences with trying to get my mental health back was really rife with shame. And so just wanting to help mob not just with treatment and appropriate treatments to their situations, not trying to fit it and mold it to suit, because a lot of it, you know, again, Dr. Westerman talking about culture-bound syndromes and things like that, as well as intervention. It's like, did it have to be this way? And you mentioned something before, and it made me think about how something that I do think helped me was I did grow up in a family that, despite the mental health, my dad really instilled really strong values in us, and I never didn't feel loved by my mum and my dad. I might have not liked what they were saying and might have, you know, rebelled a lot, which I did, but I always felt that love, and that was a big difference. And I see some people aren't so fortunate to have that, and that doesn't mean they're unlovable. And I guess there are periods in your life when, if you are in depression, you are feeling very unlovable, and that's sort of where that retreat comes from, and you're feeling so much shame. And so you asked me a question earlier about what would I say to little Kate, or, you know, anyone going through that. It's like, you matter. Like, you are so wonderful, and you have a unique gift to give the world. You know, no life on this planet isn't worth anything.
Thanks for bringing that thread back together. I think that was really beautiful. I think that's really important. You talk about, I mean, for those of you listening, we've plugged Dr. Tracy Westerman a few times.
Not sponsored.
Yeah, not sponsored. This is not
You're
a
just
sponsored
deadly
podcast.
though.
Yeah, that's it. And I'm reading her book, her memoir now, after your recommendations. I think I'm on chapter 5 at the moment, listening to the audio book. And I guess I sort of lean into that, because when I asked you about that relationship that you were in, motivation and you know, the journey and different things like that, I guess you talked about connection and relationships and how important they are in terms of our health and well-being. And I guess what was interesting was there any sort of systems intervention or experience, and has that informed or motivated any of this sort of journey as well?
Do you mean systems for...
As in experience yourself, whether personally or in your family or community, in terms of thinking about, you know, the mental health sort of sector or things like that more broadly, or, you know, you're looking at psychology as an industry. And I just thought it was interesting, you know, like we've talked about this conversation a little bit already, but that hasn't come up, which I think is important. Like it's interesting.
Yeah. Probably not in a good way. So
that's what I was leaning into a little bit. Yeah.
So, you know, we don't have, you know, my grandmother, you know, she didn't know her mother per se, but she did grow up with her father. Her mother died when she was quite young. She was an Aboriginal woman. And so not in the sense of what some mob have around, you know, forced removals, but certainly with the system itself. So grew up very, very poor. There was a period of time where my grandma was living in a tent, you know, with her family. And then, you know, all throughout her entire life, you know, aside from that period living in a tent, you know, she was living in housing commission. And when I look at systems and how that works, you know, and the impact that has, you know, at the time, there was one particular house that she applied for, and they said to her, "Oh, we'll give you this house because that's the Aboriginal house." And this thing was not livable at all. Like, I remember, like, my uncles and aunties having to, like, help when my grandma and grandpa were moving in there, to do it up and to make it livable. This thing was, like, falling apart.
Wow.
And yeah, like, I guess that's just one example of many, like with housing and you know, she was, you know, because she grew up, you know, it's the combination, and this is where the system really impacts people. And it's something that I see a lot of people who are in positions of privilege, they miss it. They lack the ability to contextualize, and they look at it in silos and not in the whole picture. So, you know, when you think about, oh, you come from low socioeconomic status, well then, you know, you are limited in your education that you can access. You're limited in the housing that you can afford, and the housing that you can afford then can have impacts to your health and your well-being. And it's all connected. And so in that aspect, the systems did definitely, they're the reason, right? It's the racism that's embedded in our systems. Like, if I wouldn't be probably here having this yarn today about pursuing psychology if my family weren't, impacted by the system, like all mob are, different ways for different mob, but everyone's impacted by it,
Was Dr. Tracy's work a catalyst for you to go down this sort of path? Obviously, there's been a journey, but like, was there something about that sort of stuff that lit a bit of a fire? And
I think so, in the sense that I never visualized myself as a psychologist, and still, the other night I was logged on studying and I was like, I don't know, like, am I cut out for this? I don't know. But probably it's really interesting, the journey and the things that I have gravitated towards throughout life, and I can start to see the connections and how I've kind of ended up there. And it's sort of, I'd say she was probably the catalyst for going, no, I'm going to apply. Like, I'm actually going to do this. We need more Indigenous psychologists. But my interest in the mind and the power of it has always been there. I was a pretty annoying kid. Like, always focused on like cause and effect. And I had to credit to my parents, honestly. They'd tell me like no for something. I'm like, you tell me why. And if that's not a valid enough reason, we're going to talk about it. And I was like real strong-headed kid, stubborn as. Strong-willed is probably a nicer way of saying it. But always just wanted to understand the bigger picture and how it connected, and I would draw connections to other things, and find patterns in things as well. And I think it's the combination of that, seeing the mental ill health in my family and caring about people, like deeply empathetic family, and that has definitely been imparted on me. Actually was going through a box of my grandfather's things, but there was a handwritten note in there from my grandmother where she was starting to, as they get a bit older, they start to try to write down some, memories and stuff of different family, and she wrote one about herself, but she pretended it wasn't, but I'm like, no, that's her. She's like, remember me. Of course we will. And so she was writing things in it, and I was like, God, that's so interesting, because while we're all individuals, it just shows how much our upbringing shapes us, and whether it's because we were impacted negatively and then we're like, no, I want to change it, or, some people are unfortunate and they don't know a life outside of what they've been living in, and they need help from and external help to that. But I looked at it, and she's writing, she's like, loves the smell of rain, rain on dirt, loves going for bushwalks, loves, what did she say? She's like, judges a movie and a book by the amount she cries. And I was like, oh my God, I'm my grandmother. Like, and so there's that beautiful empathy that she had. And honestly, like, I read a book the other day, I was weeping. Came out, I was like, oh my God. I'm like, what happened to you? I'm like, and so I think that's such a beautiful quality, and it enables connection.
Yeah, beautiful. I was thinking about some of the sort of stuff that we were talking about before this, where we were talking about some of thinking about the sort of psychology, sort of mental health and well-being space through the lens of our communities. And I think you made a note around the racial empathy gap. And I'd love if you could lean into some of that stuff that you've learned about and maybe share that, because that sort of leads into something else I want to ask you about as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I didn't, admittedly, I didn't know about that or have words for it. I'm sure we've all, mob live it and see it. But, Dr. Westerman's book, Gila, gave me words for it. And I know that it has been, something that other researchers and psychologists have explored. But the racial empathy gap is, to put it very simply, non-Indigenous people feeling that Indigenous people's suffering matters less, and that they don't feel pain as much, or almost that they're deserving of, and in some cases they do feel that they're deserving of the circumstances that are there. And I went on a course of Dr. Westerman's recently where she talked about, I feel the need to keep saying trigger warning because I think it's important, so another one here. But she talked about child suicides.
Yep.
And how, there's such a stark difference in the media in reporting on non-Indigenous versus Indigenous.
Absolutely.
And at the end of the day, they're all children and all lives matter. And so, the racial empathy gap, that's a very clear example of that, and showing that, and in particular, the media have a really big role to play in this, in how they report on things.
Absolutely.
And it's removing the human element of it. Like, we're all human beings, and that's not okay.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we've spoke about it a couple of times, particularly with regards to victimisation and how the media reports on. I mean, there was a parliamentary inquiry into missing and murdered Aboriginal women because of the disproportionate rate of which they're, exactly like you said, reported on and communicated about. So I think that's really important for people to listen and start to think about, when you start to think about how our communities and our kids start to intersect with these systems. And I think the racial empathy gap, I think you're right, like we've all felt it or experienced it, but Tracy's words give it a lens now to sort of see it through. And then there was another point as well that really stood out for me, and it was about assessment. And if you get assessment wrong, you get treatment wrong. So I wanted to lean into that and see if you had any thoughts or reflections around that.
So it's another one, and I'm giving Dr. Westerman and her book a really big plug here. But if you get it, she talks a lot about if you get assessment wrong, you get treatment wrong, and she is relating that a lot in the Gila book to culture-bound syndromes. But I think about that more holistically as well, and I feel like we see that a lot with some of the initiatives that are put in place to try to close the gaps. If you get assessment wrong, you get treatment wrong. If you don't know what it is that's causing that situation, or what it is that's actually happening, well, anything that you're throwing at it to try to fix it, it's only going to be so effective, or maybe not effective at all.
Totally.
You have to actually understand what's causing it. And there's something that, and this goes back to my childhood in wanting to know that cause and effect. I've never liked sort of like that Band-Aid solution. And that's why I always needed to know why, just full of questions and where does it come from. And that really pairs nicely with looking into it from a psychological lens, because it's like, what's actually going on? Like, what's everything that's going on here? Like, my body is a system as well. Like, how is that operating? So there's my experience that I've had, there's my brain, chemistry and the neural pathways that are happening, and how is that all interplaying to create this situation that's then causing my depression? Don't just give me the pills, like, show me how to make it better.
Totally.
And actually, I had a chat, in a job that I was in at the time. There was a really adverse situation happening in the workplace, and it was sort of like, people know that they can reach out for help if they need it. And it's like, that's not enough though, because if you're not changing the environment, how's the help actually going to make a difference? Like, it's, you might temporarily go like, I shared my thoughts with someone, but it's sort of, if I relate it back to my experiences in that relationship, if I hadn't have gotten out of that, wouldn't have mattered how much treatment I had. I'm still in that situation that's causing it.
Absolutely. Yeah, you see that as some of the biggest gaps, right? When we think about mental health and well-being more broadly, is I've read this great book, Lost Connections, about depression, and this journalist wrote it, travelled around the world speaking to leading experts and people and things like that. But it was because he'd gone through grief and loss, and so he was experiencing depression, and then he got put on antidepressants, and then was on antidepressants for 10 years, and his dose kept getting higher and higher, and he eventually goes on this journey and gets off on that. But he says nobody ever asked me like what was happening in my world. It was just addressing these symptoms for him. And so, like, in context, his grief and his depression was like a really valid human response and experience. And I think we see that time and time again. And I think it made me think about some of this through a cultural construct as well, when again, Tracy talks about, particularly in our remote communities, the incidences around what people assess as like self-harm, but is actually a really relevant cultural expression if there's sorry time happening in communities. And then so it sort of leads me into that quote, she says, you get assessment wrong, you get treatment wrong, and then things just start to snowball. And I thought that quote was a really great just a really great way to reflect how these systems are impacting our families. And it immediately made me think of child protection. Maybe the biggest thing is assessment of risk. And if we go in and we have this lens around racial empathy gap and different ways that we see our communities, and we see them through a frame of risk, what that means in terms of the disproportionate rates of which kids are removed from their families. And we see that play out here. We know in New South Wales, like 30% of kids from our communities are removed because of neglect. But we know it's generally like removed because of poverty. And we see that as risk. And so, kids are removed from their families. But I thought that was such a powerful way to how we start to think about how these systems intersect with our communities, make assessments for provision of services with our communities, but the lens of which they do that work. And I think this culture-bound way of navigating and being conscious of many of these systems have been racist systems for our communities because of how they've been set up to make judgment against and respond to. But I think, it's a really critical way for us to start to peel back how we start to think about what assessment looks like, whether that's psychology, whether that's child protection, whether that's the education system, whatever these different systems are that intersect with our people, assessment tools that are, culturally informed are critical. And I think that's one of the biggest things that come out of that, right, was that there was no cultural tools for how you measure and make assessments. And we see that across sectors too.
Yeah, and a lot of these sort of frameworks, theories, strategies, they've developed from Western colonial views, and they're not that doesn't make them right by virtue of being those things, and it doesn't make everything else wrong. And one of the units I studied, and I know that this would be a whole other yarn between you and I, but one of the units I started studying under the degree this semester was sociology, and just learning about how theories in sociology have developed from mostly middle-aged white men, and there's only this sort of evolution recently where there are more Indigenous sociologists coming through and people talking about different ways of viewing that, different social structures.
Absolutely.
And when we look at Australia and colonisation, it's so deeply embedded in our systems and that power inequity, but ultimately it is that view of we are superior to Indigenous people, and that's not the case. It's just you're just different. Your system, your way of being is just different. It's not better. Absolutely.
Yeah. This whole concept of West is best, white is right. I think someone was talking to me once about how do you understand decolonisation, and it was the most clear way that someone explained it to me was that colonisation taught us that there was one way to do things, and that was the superior way. So that whole white is right, West is best, we see it play out in exactly what you're talking about, the design of those systems. We look at education, public education, largely looks largely unchanged in the last 200 years for the most part. And a lot of these different systems, they operate from that frame and that sort of space. Whereas decolonisation recognises or remembers that there was always more than one way, and that neither is better than the other, whereas I think there's this friction sometimes, right? Whereas if you fall outside of the standard system, it's almost, if you've deviated from the norm, it's almost perceived as less than, or outside the mainstream, as opposed to like we're actually all supposed to be in the same river together.
Yeah, exactly. And our diversity is what makes us beautiful. It shouldn't be what's dividing us and causing, conflict. And I was thinking about this the other day, and I think it's really relevant here with talking about systems. It's like it's not enough either to just overlay Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural considerations onto the existing system. Like, that's not how that works. And people tend to, I don't want to generalise here, sorry. There are some people that think that that is systemic change by just going, oh, well, I'm going to pick and choose when the voices come in and when the culture comes in. And it's like, no, you actually have to rethink that whole thing, because that whole thing has been structured with the view of that superiority versus inferiority. And it's not... it's not about you continuing to hold the reins and go, I decide when I give you power and when I don't. That's actually not power equity.
Totally.
Yeah, so I was thinking about that a lot, and just the overlay of, or just tack it onto the top.
Yeah.
And it often, I've seen that actually create more challenges for mob, different challenges, but more, because they're having to navigate different things, and it's sort of, it's not reflective of their culture, but the system thinks that that's sufficient.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like, well, what are you complaining about? We've already fixed it. And you're like, nah, like,
definitely
not yet.
Definitely. That makes me think about how that sort of connects with how we think about close the gap. You talk about this, trying to layer things on top of each other, and things being more superior and then the others and things like that. You've had a bit of experience in the close the gap space professionally. I think much of what we talk about is intersected with much of that work as well. But what are your sort of thoughts in terms of the yarns that we're having and how that reflects out in terms of what we see play out in policy? Yeah,
I think our perspectives and our views still aren't valued. Like, it's like, oh, we'll just, and it's so siloed again, like it's not looking at it as a system. And it's also looking at the different layers of that system too, and how they're not working together. So it's not, I guess maybe not working together is the word, because that's the silos, right? Like, certain areas, it's like, we're just housing, we're just language, like, and you've got leads on that, and that's sort of all they're looking at. But they're not looking at the interconnectedness of it all, and how within one Aboriginal person's life, every single target in the national agreement, in some way, shape or form, they are filling the result of that gap. In some way in their family, there is every gap there, because it's, it's language, it's education, it's housing, it's all of those things. And so, when we look at, the yarn that we've been having so far, it's the entire system has racism built into it. And yeah, it's come a long way, but there's still a long way to go. And it needs to start working as a system and not as silos, and stop sort of people kind of going, oh, I'm just staying in my lane. It's everybody's responsibility. Mob didn't colonise themselves.
Totally.
I used to deliver cultural training a little while ago, and you'd get a lot of sort of questions and robust discussions in those sessions. And one of the things I used to try to explain to people, to try to contextualise, because they'd be like, well, like, people, the opportunity's there, and it's like, it's actually not, though. We continue to put the accountability back on mob, back on the individual, and that's not okay. And we don't do, well, actually, I don't want to say that, but like, there's less, because of the racial empathy gap, there's less sort of, what do you call it, like, resistance to it. When we're looking at, these elderly people, they need, services, and they need care and they need funding from government. They can't do it themselves. Whereas when it's mob, often it's like, the media or certain people out there saying like really harmful stuff that's not true. Like, oh, they just don't want to get better, or they just like living that way. No, they don't.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think some of that, a lot of this sort of stuff being rooted in racism or rooted in colonisation and how metrics for success fit within those worlds. So, like, we look at how, for over a decade, almost two, the gaps continued to get bigger. We're like, as a policy sort of stance, it's getting wider and wider. And I always think about how, like, much of those metrics for success are rooted in how we're measured within those systems. So, like, for example, like, education, education outcomes are measured based on how that's tracked within that system. And so we look at, like, we've only got one model of education, but then you go into, like, remote communities where kids are speaking 5 languages, and then they're expected to engage with one standardized system of education within a remote community. That's the same system that is in metro, like, cities and stuff. And so, like, many of those communities are going to be measured unfavorably because they're going to sit outside of, like, they've just been given, again, that West is best model. That every community should fit within this one system, and if you don't, well, that there's a problem or there's a challenge, as opposed to thinking about, using education as the example, thinking about, like, well, how do we design education that is, place-based, community-specific, culturally informed? Because, almost any young person I've ever met with has always really valued education and learning. It's just a matter of, like, how accessible that is, how safe that is, how they're able to fully bring their whole selves to participate in those spaces, and different things like that. If we accept the reality of the impacts of trauma in our communities, and we know the impacts of what that does in terms of our developmental sort of stuff as well, let alone being able to show up socially and emotionally, we have to accept that those mainstream systems aren't equipped to respond and provide spaces that are accessible and safe for people to be able to participate. So if we really want to see shifts in gaps closing, we need to start to think a bit more broad around how we provide systems responses that are accessible for our people too. I think it's it's something that I reckon if we don't, we're continuing to see the same path that we're going down already.
And it's sort of, it's not accessible just because it's there, right? Like, it's like, oh, but there's one, we've got a little structure in that community, like, that's accessible. It's like, no, it's not accessible if the people in there, if their views are embedded, discrimination's embedded in their views in the way that they're engaging. It's not accessible if it's not reflecting your culture. And if you don't trust it, there's such a distrust there, and rightly so. So much harm that's been caused and continues to be caused, and it's sort of like comes into that really harmful narrative around, you should just get over it, move forward, it's all fine, we're all equal. It's like, no, we're not all equal. That's Absolutely. Not how that works. But they're super, like, you guys do some really awesome work around that education piece and giving people some really great tools or steps that they can do to help either make things more accessible or start to dig deeper in that learning journey. So I know, like, acknowledgement of country is a good example of not doing it tokenistically.
Kay's getting commission here for plugging all our content we chuck out there.
Just getting uncomfy with all the questions being at me. Yeah. So I guess that accessibility, it's like, it doesn't always have to be this massive thing either. You can start with those incremental steps and just where you're coming from with it.
You've spent, a significant portion of your adult career in the sort of Aboriginal affairs space. we've got staff here that have worked with you in the past, and can't speak more highly of the work that you do and who you are personally and professionally as well.
I didn't pay them.
Yeah. But yeah, I guess and we've touched on, a lot of the personal stuff interconnects with what we talk about in terms of what our communities are navigating as well. But what do you sort of see as some of the, big priorities for how we think about whether it's Close the Gap, whether it's Aboriginal affairs more broadly? What are some of the big sort of levers that you think we need to be focusing on or investing in?
I think we need to, it's that power inequity, right, that is everywhere, and it's sort of like, the application of grants, just that reliance upon government, and people seem to think that just because there are grants there, that's enough. It's like, that's not the long-term vision here, or solution. Like, you actually need people to not need that anymore. You need people to not have to be at the continued mercy of government, because they have been since colonisation, and that needs to shift and change. So that's one of the key areas, that power inequity, and that can start in a very I guess we talked about incremental steps before. People understanding the differences between consultation, and I know you guys do a lot of that work around co-design and what does that look like, and people use a lot of those terms interchangeably, and they're not the same. And
Absolutely.
It's building up to then have that be a part of the process. It's not addressing the power inequity it should not be subject to the person in the role and how they feel about it, and going, I'm gonna co-design on this, but then the next person, they're like, nah, I'm just gonna consult. It needs to be in our structures. There needs to be sufficient guidelines, and their voices need to be informing that and driving that, because too often those things are created without the voices and perspectives, and then afterwards it's sort of like, what do you fellas think of this? And I don't know, and I give you 10 seconds to look at it, and then we're going to implement it anyway. So that's the addressing of it, elevating the voices. And you hear this a lot about closing the gap, with the findings of the independent review, decisions about us, not without us. And that's really, we will see the gap start to shift the more we actually properly invest in that. Decisions about
Share
us,
power,
not without us. Yeah,
absolutely. What would you say are some of the biggest? That's a massive one that you're talking about, like sharing power, shared decision making, and different stuff like that. What are some of the biggest? I guess not going to say highlights, but positive outcomes you've been able to see professionally throughout your journey when you've seen things done well.
Probably some of the biggest highlights in my career journey have been when First Nations voices have been there, when mob are driving the design of programs for them, and really leaning into that, and just that you see the confidence shift, and they go from some of the leadership development programs that I used to lead. That sounds really funny, doesn't it? I used to lead leadership development programs. You'd see mob come in in the start of those programs, and they'd be really shy, and there's a lot of shame, and then as they start to connect with more mob and lean in, and they know that it's a safe space, and they can use their Aboriginal English, or whatever that might be, share aspects of their culture and the challenges that they're going through, they start to really open up, and then they're joking around, and they're feeling confident, and then they're going for that promotion, and if they don't get it, they're like, don't worry sis, you didn't need that, they missed out, and they're like, yeah, they did miss out.
That's it.
And just that beautiful sense of self-worth and self-confidence starts to grow, because you have that autonomy in your own life plus the connection. So it's that power inequity, and being in control of decisions about you and the outcomes in your life as much as you can, and then connecting with others through that. That's the recipe. Yeah,
I love that. So much of it comes back to connection, hey? Connection and relationships. I think it's a really nice thread. You are a very special artist, very talented, which I didn't know when I first met you. See, I didn't know for about 12 months, and then, whoa, hang on, okay, wow, there you go. So, but then in addition to that, so very creative, very talented as an artist. You always known that you had that skill? Some people discover it later in life, like you've always been a creator?
Not this little Kate here. I grew up in a really creative family. So mum was an artist, my grandfather was an artist, lots of musicians in my family, poetry, just like people just feel real deeply and just need to get it all out.
Yeah.
And so growing up around that was just really normal to me, and I guess those resources like instruments or art supplies and stuff, that was all just such a part of my childhood. And so from the minute I kind of engaged with that stuff, I just loved it. And I've done it since I was little. Mum always used to say, she still says it to this day, she's like, you didn't draw stick figures like some kids do. Yeah. She's like, you're out there doing these like big Kate's there for hours making this big beautiful piece of artwork. And so it's not until sort of recently when I've really lent into sort of thinking about psychology and, neuroscience and things like that, the impacts of creativity, creative expression, storytelling, on our mental health and well-being, but also our ability to communicate. And I didn't realise, and it's sort of, I talked a little bit earlier about those threads that you kind of don't realise, and then you look back at your life and you're like, oh, it all makes sense now. Yeah. It was happening, it was just bubbling away, and that's always been a way that I've been most comfortable to express myself through art or music. And just a lot of those challenging times that I faced growing up, I'd turn that awful situation into something beautiful. I could create something from it. And beautiful doesn't necessarily mean it was like glossy and amazing. Sometimes I've written really, really heart-wrenching songs just because I was going through such hard stuff. And you don't have to release them to the world, but it's just this ability to process your emotions, but you're not bound by so much of that structure. It's open and expansive. I started reading a book on art therapy because that's eventually one of the modalities that I want to explore with and specialize in as a psychologist, to use art to help people process their emotions and express what they're going through, but also to it's mindfulness as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, we talked about, we did a mental health and wellbeing podcast the other month with 13 Yarn. And
you were talking about colouring in Peppa Pig.
Yeah, talking about colouring in talking about doing it in the prison with all these really hard young people that have been locked up for heavy stuff, and just spinning out that they're all sitting there so relaxed, but their nervous system was regulating as they're doing all this, and colouring in Peppa the Pig, and all the kids are left 20 minutes ago, but it's it also reminds me a lot, I'm a big fan of slam poetry, and I was at an event a couple of months ago now, and I was sitting there and I was just thinking about how healing a lot of the poetry is. A lot of we were in New York, and so we had a lot of people from African American, Latino communities and poets there sharing their poetry, and so much of it is grounded in the history of very similar histories of the impacts of colonization and racial trauma, and just the everyday struggle of existing in countries where you might be seen and having a different lived experience to others around you, but so much strength and heal, so much healing in that sort of space coming through in that creative expression. Really, really inspiring stuff. I love it so much, and I think the piece that I wrote, it's the only piece I've ever written, but it came about because there'd been a suicide of my friend's brother in my community, and I remember the moment that I wrote it, and I wrote this poem in one sitting, and it had been a real heavy period of time. The George Floyd verdict had just come in as well in America. There'd been another suicide in our community, and then my friend's brother had taken his life, and so it was just this compounding sort of weight that was just bubbling away, and I just was working remotely. I think this was around one of the first lockdowns, so there was a bit of workplace flexibility, and I was working from the library, and I just saw this sign for slam poetry heats coming up, and something just told me like, fuck, I need to get this out. And that's where it was like a vomit, and it felt so good to just get it out of me and put it on a piece of paper. And I didn't realize when I wrote that poem that there was so much in there that needed to come out around the experiences of our people and the intersection with the colony, but also around how that manifests and exists with regards to our history of kids being taken, that is still a reality today, and and how that all intersects. But I wanted something in there that was also strengths based and was about the future and healing and our young people coming after us, and it's just leaning into that when you talk about the impact of art as therapy, I think is so powerful.
Absolutely. And when you look at like our cultures, it's storytelling has been such a significant part of that, and not, it hasn't been bound to written word per se. Like, there's singing and there's dancing and there's art and there's, language and pairing all of that, and not just having to use one form of expression. And did you find when you were writing it that you didn't curate yourself as much? Because I know sometimes when we're like talking or like writing in a certain way for something, like maybe it's an article or an essay or something like that, we'll really curate ourselves as we're doing it.
Yeah.
And it's like sometimes when you're doing it creatively, you just let it go.
Absolutely.
Especially if you've listened to it and just gone, I just need to just pour this out right now.
Definitely. And I think I've had writer's block ever since then because it was such a visceral expression of something. I've sat down a couple of times, probably only a handful of times, to try and write again, and I just can't. Like, it's just not there right now. And I think part of me is frustrated with that, but then part of me also really loves that, because I really feel like that piece that I did write, I was supposed to write it, and I was supposed to write it like that, and that's how it's just supposed to stay. Which is its own yarn there. But leaning into that sort of, we're talking about your expertise as an artist and how this connects into much of the conversation that we've had today. And you, I know you're a fan of Brené Brown, and she's got this great quote around stories are data for the soul. So I lean into that to let you reflect or speak to that, but also in the context of you also doing work in terms of co-authoring children's books and doing some amazing work with some amazing people doing great stuff in our communities. But around that sort of stuff, stories of data for the soul, like how does that sort of sit with you in terms of the conversations and the journey that we've been on with this conversation and that sort of stuff as well?
I think it's it probably takes every sort of lens that we've taken so far. It's really, really nice quote to bring in now around when we look at data, often the way that it's gathered, there's so many layers to it. It's like the lack of consent. It's like how it's being used. Is it being portrayed in a very subjective way? Like, is someone adding their lens to it when they're conveying it? Have you removed the human element from it? And I find that happens so often, and data doesn't actually exist separate of when you're looking at like data on people or any living thing. It doesn't exist separate of that living thing, and we take the life out of it and we strip it away. And when we look at that story element, it tells you the whole picture. And it depends what data you're pulling out. You're never going to get that full picture. And so I love that you're actually able to just have that narrative in that. And I know that, some people find narrative therapy really helpful as well. And however you like to express story, that's so important. So you could just, go, Kate Webber is an Aboriginal woman and just look at some demographic data of me. It doesn't tell my story. It doesn't, enable me the ability to express my identity and have those distinctions that are unique to me and my environment. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, I love it because we do a stack of work around research and evaluation, but we really champion storytelling and qualitative data as such, and yarning as critical Indigenous research methodology, you know, for getting exactly what you just said, like really rich, meaningful understanding of people's experiences or what we're trying to explore together. I think you're right. Like, I love that quote. And in the context of that, like, and where you've gone to in terms of this storytelling journey and what you're doing in that sort of space, can you share a little bit about that for us?
So I guess have always wanted to storytell, and I guess there's these threads again of connection and story and creativity and mental health, and it intertwines, and have always had such a deep passion for kids. They're our future. I'm a mother hen as well. Anybody that knows me is like, oh, wow, you're fussing too much. Like, my husband's like, leave me alone, I don't need your help. And I'm like, yeah, you do.
Totally. Always.
So like, I think it's been a natural evolution, and I was like the oldest of my cousins as well, so the oldest of my siblings, I was very much looking after them. Dad would go away because he was in the Navy, and I'd be like mum's sort of second in charge. It's like, right, you two step up. Definitely. Kate's here. Totally. So yeah, I think that has been, I guess, why I've gravitated towards that. But also growing up, like, there's not been much literature that I could see myself reflected in, or people that I knew, and that's so important. And we think about our babies and their sense of identity, and the impact that has on their life, the goals that they set for themselves, the things that they can achieve. Like, they can do incredible things, and I want them to know that. And there are so many stories that need telling that haven't been told, and I think it's something that I will just be so passionate about probably until my final days. And I think that's legacy, right? Like, people talk a lot about legacy, and sometimes it's very self-focused, like, oh, I want to know that I've people still remember me. For me, like, personally, like, legacy is things that I've talked about previously, where, like, my grandmother's got this generosity of spirit, my mother's got this generosity of spirit, like, and that's carrying forward. So the legacy of having your identity reflected in the stories and the literature, and knowing that you are enough and that you matter and that you're beautiful, like, I think that's just so essential for our babies, and that to me is, you pass that down and it's living in them, and it might not be attached to one person, but that is legacy.
Yeah, I love that.
I'm getting real handsy. I was like,
oh. Man, I love it. And are you able to talk about the most recent book that you co-authored, or is that public knowledge yet about the progress there?
Not public.
Or is this an exclusive by the time this comes out?
This is probably a little exclusive, so I'll talk a little bit about it, but not too specific, just in case.
Totally.
No, it's all good. So the way I guess the way that came about, I was working at the Languages Trust at the time. I don't even know, I'm going to plug this fellow and he doesn't even know. And ended up obviously connecting with Clark when he was, Clark Webb, when he was one of the board members there. Yep. And just through the yarning that we were doing, and in particular the space that I was working was that policy research space. So, working a lot with the Gumbengia Gingana Freedom School. And so through that, and the yarns that we were having, I was like, oh, I had a dream the other night. And he's like, oh yeah. And I'm like, I dreamt that we wrote a children's book, and I don't know why, but I just feel like this is, and I think because my passion, but also he's working in that education, space with the children, and they're bilingual. I thought there's something special here, and I really want to help them. And at the time he was also talking about how they need more language learning resources in that revitalization. And, I thought how special to be able to create something for the school, but then to also show, Australia more broadly, like, this is, Gumbengia language, and it matters, and it's beautiful, and this is a story connected to them that you can all engage with. There's nothing stopping you engaging with it, and knowing its beauty and its impact. So, yeah, that's how that came about. It's been a long time coming. It was a while ago that I worked there, and so it's been bubbling away. But yeah, very excited to publish that soon.
Exciting. And I think, how I think most people that are unfamiliar with the Aboriginal languages space will be surprised in terms of how actually strong the New South Wales Aboriginal language revitalisation journey is amongst so many different language groups here in this state. And I think even myself as an Aboriginal person, when we both worked at the Aboriginal Languages Trust at different stages, but even myself growing up in Sydney City, in Glebe and Redfern, it was so powerful for me to meet Clark and see the work that they're doing up there on Gumbaynggirr country, and thinking like, wow, this is in New South Wales. Like, this is like, we can drive here. This is not remote communities. This is regional centres and places that are really, really prominent in this state that are revitalising language and doing the most amazing things with our young people. And I think it's exciting to think about the generations ahead for that language. And Clark's one of many that have blazed that trail to champion that work as well. So yeah, really special to do that and do that together. And I think hopefully we get to go on a similar sort of journey together as well, and do something. I think we've talked about that for a while now as well, and thinking about how special it would be to try and work on something that could be a bit of a resource is the wrong word, but something that could be a bit of a tool and a story for a young person who might be, people that might listen that might know or not know. I have a lived experience of forced child removal. My sister was a ward of the state, and I think when we had some of these conversations around concepts for storytelling, I often think about how powerful a resource like that could have been for myself, maybe more so my sister, who was a bit younger as well. But stories about, I think about kids, I think about my sister and myself when we were removed, and that feeling of isolation and that question of belonging and loneliness. And I think about the power of a story that could speak to kids like that, all kids, but particularly kids like that, and help them understand and know that they're never really ever alone, and that they're always connected back somewhere. And I think we're still, nutting out and storyboarding what that journey looks like, but I think we could together, co-create something really special. And I think it comes back to everything we're talking about, right? So many different threads are emerging with this yarn today around connection, around art as therapy, for us, let alone for people that consume that sort of stuff as well, is really, really special. But I feel like we've dived into a lot of different stuff here today, and we've looked at some personal parts of your journey that you've been really open about sharing, and we've also looked at your professional journey and other personal stuff that you're doing creatively and different things like that as well. I think coming towards our time together, is there anything that you feel like we haven't touched on that you'd like to explore, or is there any sort of final thoughts or messages or anything like that for anyone that's been listening?
Just super grateful to have had this yarn. There's probably any number of thought bubbles bubbling away, but it'll probably take us down another really deep yarn. So, just want to thank you so much, for inviting me here and having me share some of my story, and being so, creating such a beautiful, warm space to be able to do that. And I hope that, for any mob that are, listening to the podcast, watching the video, that you've taken something away from it, and, always looking to connect as well. So, if you do are interested in a collaboration of anything that you've heard, reach out to me, or even just for a yarn. You've heard many times that value connection, so always looking for that too.
Absolutely. And we'll make sure we put up in the show notes links to where that people can find you as well, so they can reach out and connect and get those details if they want to do that sort of stuff too. I think this is, we've known each other for a little minute now and done some stuff together, so I'm sure this will be not the last time we connect and talk about this sort of stuff, and I'd love to get you back on as well and hear how the journey is progressing, because I think we've talked about, again, a range of different threads, and so really excited to see where that journey goes and what learning we can share from that journey with our communities as well. So the start of many, I'm sure, but thank you so much for making the time, and really appreciate it.
Beautiful. Thank you.